Good morning. My name is Billy Carter-Rankin, and today I will be talking about time, archive, and memory in relation to my practice. While working on this talk, I was having a difficult time reflecting on my work as far as making connections between what I've created in the past and what I'm creating currently. I started making work at SAIC around more broader social justice issues and ended up creating more personal work. I recently began making a timeline of my experience at SAIC since last fall and began a comparison of what I created at school and what was going on in my personal life, specifically with family. Within this timeline, I started realizing how much my experience I refused to deal with, mainly because I was losing who I was creating work for. I entered SAIC with the mindset that I would create work that would represent underrepresented stories and cultures. However, my work began to take a different turn. Instead of creating work about representation, my practice led me to take a more internal look at myself. I wanted to respond to events happening around me and in the world, but I didn't exactly understand how to explore this within my practice. As I completed my timeline, I finally started to notice links between my practice and my personal life through themes of erasure, memory, and archive. Can you guys hear me okay? During my first semester at SAIC, I started making work dealing with gun violence in the US, focusing on police brutality. I was thinking about how mainstream media depicts the victims of police brutality and the various ways of how victims' loved ones combat those narratives. I began creating a makeshift memorial in my studio, gathering items such as toys, candles, and recreating posters and images to create a mass memorial paying homage to police brutality victims. I also wanted to show the passage of time within the piece by adding flowers and burning candles and leaving them to slowly age and deteriorate as they remained in my studio. The flowers would wither up and darken, and the candles would slowly melt down until they were puddles of wax on the floor. Additionally, I incorporated different items from more publicized memorials, such as a trail of roses from the memorial of Michael Brown, who was shot and killed in 2014 by an officer in Ferguson, Missouri, along with a sign from that same memorial. I also included a poster with the poem from the memorial of Laquan McDonald, who was shot by an officer in Chicago that same year. I was thinking about how a community chooses to remember a loved one in this context, along with who considers this type of remembrance valid and why. In my research, I began looking up news articles about makeshift memorials, not limited to police brutality, and found a recent article from Camden, New Jersey. In February 2019, a 17-year-old girl was struck and killed by a police cruiser. Devastated from the trauma of losing a loved one, the girl's family constructed a memorial in her honor. The aunt of the teenage girl stated that she would always keep a light on for her through the creation of makeshift memorials. She described the memorial bringing comfort, being a reminder of the young girl's spirit, and a salve for this sudden loss. Everyone in the community did not feel the same way about the memorial, however. Camden Councilman Angel Fuentes, with the support of surrounding homeowners in the neighborhood, proposed a bill that would allow roadside memorials to be removed after 15 days. He suggested that the memorials left in place too long mar the landscape, potentially lowering property values and serving as an unwelcome reminder of near constant violence. There has been great opposition to the short turnaround for the removal of these memorials. However, other cities in New Jersey regulate the time frame of these memorials by classifying them under litter laws. I began considering what is the proper way to remember an individual. How long is one allowed to mourn a loss? What items are deemed acceptable to remember an individual permanently? There are a number of statues and monuments throughout the world made from a variety of materials such as stone, marble, and more that immortalize specific individuals that have somewhat significance to the area that the memorial is located. These memorials were funded by the government and built using strong, withstanding materials that were meant to last for centuries. However, what happens when a community uses materials that cost much less to immortalize the loss of one of its members? Is that memorial any less valuable in meaning because of the items used? How powerful is the impact of labeling a memorial as litter? I went on to research the impact of words and phrases and found the article Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students and the Power of Labels. Dee Addy discusses the impact of language, focusing on the use of the word diverse to describe students in a classroom. Addy argues that one cannot sense if a student is diverse based off looks alone. The student may appear white in America, but may be from France, for example. Addy explains that particular words and phrases manifest and reinforce power and dominance in that area. How words are classified determine the social power of those within that classification. Addy explains that the way students are described or labeled has implications on how they are perceived or treated. Addy goes on to continue this logic to connect this logic to victims of police brutality, such as 17-year-old Michael Brown and 12-year-old Tamir Rice, and how they were portrayed by the media. She elaborates, they have been described with words like menacing, troublemakers, and criminals, displacing words like innocent, unarmed, or victim. The words used to describe these boys have the power to influence how these individuals are framed in public perception and within the courtroom. Words like dangerous and threatening have very different effect from words like unarmed and target. The emphasis shifts the threat of violence from the attacker in one instance to the attacked in the other. Makeshift memorials act as an alternative way to remember the deceased. In some contexts, these memorials are in direct contrast to how an individual is viewed in the mainstream. These memorials serve as a narrative. They represent what an individual meant to their community. It is a curation of items by loved ones to keep one's legacy alive. Words and phrases manifest power. Specific phrases such as gone but not forgotten and we will not forget reinforce the individual's presence and their value to the world. No justice, no peace maintains determination towards an effort to rightfully bring justice to the loss of a person's life. Labeling these memorials as litter attempts to belittle the memorial's impact and importance within a community. It was situations such as Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Laquan McDonald, and more that inspired my work during my first year at SAIC. I started considering how communities combat how their loved ones are remembered in contrast to mainstream media. I started considering what made a memorial valid versus litter. I began constructing my own monument to begin trying to answer these questions. What would it mean for a makeshift monument to take up space in a white wall gallery? Who would deem it as valid? Who would reduce it to a collection of junk? What kind of experiences would fuel these perspectives? I considered what attracts individuals to create a memorial for a loved one versus mourning their loved one privately. Jeffrey L. Durbin touches on this in his article, Expressions of Mass Grief and Mourning, the Material Culture of Makeshift Memorials. He states, such memorials represent a deeply human impulse to create a permanent reminder of those who have been lost, especially when the loss was partially through the sacrifice of those who died. Many times, the stated purpose for erecting memorials is to inspire future generations to emulate a similar level of courage, honor, and altruism. At the same time, the creation of memorials may also play an important role in the process of recovering from traumatic events. These memorials not only commemorate a person's life, but also provides healing to contributors of the memorial. I began thinking about this as I collected items for my work. The first time I presented this work was in front of people was in October of 2018. There were individuals who were already familiar with roadside memorials and did not spend time with the piece for too long. There were others who would come into the space and avoid talking about the memorial altogether. They would glance for a few seconds and then walk away. There were also individuals who were drawn to the work and would stare for a little while. They would be touched by what the piece represented and then move on to something else. There were even individuals who questioned whether or not the piece belonged in a white wall gallery due to its sacredness and the sensitivity towards the subject. This made me think about how much location affects the impact of these memorials. Can makeshift memorials only exist outside at specific sites? Can it take up other forms? This is something I posted earlier this year on my friend's Facebook page. In February of this year, my childhood friend, Montrell Marks, was murdered. My post and similar posts from his loved ones can be found on his Facebook wall. If you go to his Facebook, you see the following message on top of the page. Remembering Trell Marks. We hope people who love Trell will find comfort in visiting his profile to remember and celebrate his life. Learn more about the legacy, contact setting, and memorialized accounts on Facebook. I began analyzing how memorials began to take form on the internet, specifically through social media. When an individual passes away, what happens to their social media accounts? Usually, loved ones pay their respects on that person's page and use that person's pictures and previous posts to keep their memory alive. In the article, Managing Your Digital Afterlife by Carrie Arnold, various Facebook users were interviewed about their experience with loss on the social media platform. Nearly 60% of the respondents said that online grieving was more helpful and valuable than traditional grieving rituals. Memorial sites, after all, can be made accessible to a broad array of individuals and can last as long as the participants need support. Rather than having to worry about maneuvering around city laws and negative labeling, loved ones from various places can pay their respects as often as they would like. The article also mentions that people tend to go back to these pages on anniversaries, birthdays, and holidays as a way to keep part of their loved one alive. However, because there are not many regulations on what happens to one's social media platforms once they die, the fate of some accounts may be unknown. This is from my cousin's profile, who passed away 10 years ago. His profile picture was still present until the past couple of years when Facebook removed the image so that an anonymous profile icon appears when you visit his page. Carrie Arnold further indicates in her article that the lack of legislation after one's death means that the ownership of your profile can revert back to the company who owns that site after your death unless you specify otherwise. Another possible issue that comes with social media memorials is relying on technology to do the remembering versus relying on one's memory. Hannah Arendt expressed her fear of technology in doing the thinking for us. If it is becoming optional to remember, does this imply that we are becoming better at forgetting? I would personally argue that memory is not always the most reliable either. Memory can be fleeting as time goes on, and the documentation of memories through technology can help an individual hold on to their loved one's memory longer than solely relying on their own recollection. Through my research of the purpose of makeshift memorials and the many forms it can take, I became interested in finding simple modes of making to contrast with complex ideas. I considered how items within a makeshift memorial can serve as an archive reflecting a person's life, such as stuffed animals to commemorate the life of a child. I began considering the permanence of various materials and how we assign value to these materials. These thoughts carried over into my following more personal work. In October of 2018, my family remodeled our kitchen, which held close to 100 cards my grandmother collected over the years from her loved ones. She would duct tape them over our kitchen sink, which made a collage of memories. When the remodel happened, the cards were snatched off the wall and ready to be thrown in the trash. I told my mother to place the cards in a bag for me to collect the next time I went home. As I went home, I also looked at the collection of 20-plus photo albums my grandparents had stored that filled the shelves of our living room. I took a few albums along with the cards and headed back to my studio. I organized the cards in as many different ways as I could. I felt that there was something deeper to discuss with these cards than just a feeling of nostalgia. I began trying to make sense of them by organization. I first organized them by event, such as Christmas, Easter, birthdays, anniversaries, and more. I then reorganized them by place. This was mainly with the postcards. Some cards were domestic and others were international. I reorganized them again by who sent the cards. A great deal of them came from friends of my grandmother. I noticed there was a mix of postcards and greeting cards, which both had dates written on them. I started arranging them by date, piling up cards that were sent in the same month and year. I then began taking my grandmother's photos and began to match the dates of the images and cards and then would hang them together. I started considering what the social climate was during the time the images were taken and the cards were sent. How might the events happening at the time affect how these pictures were taken? How are these pictures perceived at the time? What within the image was considered of value? How could these events impact what cards were sent, along with what was written in the cards and how the cards were interpreted? I began looking up news articles around the same time the images and cards were sent, and I began to match up news articles to specific dates from the images and cards. I began looking up notable news stories during the time of the images and cards, and then began to consider which publications to include. I started looking at more national headlines, such as the New York Times, and then began looking for more local newspapers, such as the Milwaukee Sentinel, where my grandparents lived. Then I began thinking about what was considered mainstream media versus what was considered alternative. This led me to look for more Black-owned newspapers, such as the Chicago Defender. I was considering how the various types of media attempted to influence viewers, and how these attempts may or may not have affected how my grandmother and her loved ones viewed themselves at the time. My next step was to ask my grandmother about the media she consumed growing up. However, an unexpected event in my personal life altered the way I would view the work as I continued. In February of this year, my father passed away unexpectedly. My relationship with my father was complicated. He wasn't a consistent figure in my life, which put a strain on our relationship. Our last phone call was 6 minutes. After he died, I found myself romanticizing his memory out of grief. Although our relationship was not always in a positive place, I was choosing to only dwell on the few moments our relationship was strong. As I caught myself doing this, I began considering how time and emotion can influence memory. I began writing 6-minute journal entries about my father, and then read them a couple months later to see how the mind can forget or exaggerate specific details based on one's emotional state. Within the next few months, I was offered an opportunity to travel to Japan and create work for the 2019 Satsuchi Triennale in Takamatsu, Kagawa. I began studying Japanese culture and tradition and became interested in the function of the traditional Japanese family home. My site was at the historic architectural park Shikokumura, and I chose the Yamashita family house for my installation. The house's history is about functionality and simplicity, which is a common theme I recognized as I walked around the town of Takamatsu. I was drawn to the functionality of the windows. I noticed various houses with traditional washi paper installed in the screens to cool the house from the sun. I noticed various textures of the glass in the windows to ensure privacy. Thinking of functionality of the home made me think of functionality within a family. What expectations do we place on a mother, father, sibling, or grandparent that validates how we think a family should function? During my stay in Japan, I also became intrigued with other Japanese traditions, such as calligraphy. As I read over the journal entry of my father, I started considering how language can also play a role in distorting memory. When a story is passed along through multiple people, how does the perspectives of those individuals influence how the story is told? I had one of my entries translated in Japanese and then collaborated with Shu Yan, a fellow colleague of mine from Tokyo University of the Arts, to write the translation of my text on washi paper with traditional sumi ink and Japanese calligraphy. Through these various layers of translation, my text slowly became altered over time, demonstrating further how memory can be distorted as time passes. In my piece, Holding On, in memory of Bill Carter, I used functional materials such as washi paper and plexiglass to distort the text in one of my journal entries. I wanted the audience to see the overall effect of time on memory from the front of the work, but also able to look between each layer and see the process of how the text had slowly been altered. I placed this piece in a traditional Japanese home, designed for function and simplicity, to contrast how distorted and complex our memories can become. While thinking of memory in this way, I returned to my grandmother's archive with new questions. With looking at newspaper and media in relation to my grandmother's images, I wondered if I was only viewing the work from solely a representational aspect. What was I adding to the conversation of representation? Was that even a conversation I wanted this work to be a part of? What am I trying to achieve with these images? I then began to question visibility. What good is visibility if it's only that? I wanted my work to serve as more than just representation or documentation. What would it mean to combat visibility? To still present Black figures, but not in a way that the figures are viewed as a novelty. This is when I began analyzing erasure. I began scanning a few of my grandmother's images and painting them the same color as my studio, as a way to have the images blend in with their environment. I began studying Gerhard Richter's methods for painting over photographs and started experimenting with form and gesture. I would pay attention to what was happening in the image and paint according to the actions I would see portrayed by my family. Some photos I would paint heavy coats over so that one could only see a ghostly figure. Others I would vaguely paint over, leaving remnants that allowed viewers to get a general sense of what was happening in the image, but not be able to make out specific details such as one's facial expressions. I was interested in what Richter referred to as two realities, what was happening in the photograph and what was happening on top of the photograph. I wanted to combine intentionality and chance when manipulating the image. I would do a specific gesture and let the image react to the paint in its own way over time. A huge component I was considering while doing this was the effect of time. I considered these specific moments of my grandmother's memory being captured, and although these moments were preserved, how much is remembered by looking at these images? I interviewed my grandmother looking through these images, which were baby books of my uncles and my mom. I would point to an image and ask her to recall a specific memory. She remembered, however, she was very short with me. She would only tell me what I asked of her instead of choosing to elaborate. My grandmother has always been a reserved woman, and in being this reserved, it prevents me from preserving her memory with these images. This led me to wonder if it was even my place to preserve these memories. Are there certain memories my grandmother wanted to preserve for herself? Are there memories that she wants to end with her rather than carry on through generations after her? Does she want to be remembered for who she is now versus who she was before? Is being reserved how she controls her archive? I then began to think about the different ways to fade an image or how to initiate erasure. I was really interested in the passage of time with these images and how to physically represent that passage of time. I looked to my grandmother's postcards for inspiration. I organized them by date and arranged them in a grid form in my studio. I thought about the Rosalind Cross essay about the spatial function of the grid. I wanted to contrast the personal messages of the cards with a flattened, geometric, unnatural format to see how it would affect my interaction with the cards. While analyzing the cards, I was able to physically see the passage of time through the deterioration of the material. I analyzed grease stains, faded masking tape marks, dust, hair, and more. I began thinking about the cards in relation to my body. There's a card from the year that I was born that looks worn down, ready to deteriorate at any moment. Yet looking at myself being the same age as this card, I look very young. Someone could look at me and make the assumption that I still have a great deal of life ahead of me. I began thinking about the temporality of materials and using that temporality to age the archive. This is also the same postcard. It's vertical, and then I switched it to be horizontal to show the writing. I took Kodak Selenium toner with a synthetic brush to paint over more images of reprinted scans of my grandmother's archive. Some images I brushed over lightly, others I soaked in toner for a period of time and took them out. A few I brushed over once doing a specific gesture. I've been allowing the images to transform over time and documenting the process. The images began as more of a harsh red tone and have been slowly transforming into more brown and purple tones. I incorporated the same practice I used for the paint. I would perform a specific gesture and allow chance and time to alter the images. I watched the toner slowly distort faces, details, corners of an image, and more. I wanted to test with satin prints and then go into the darkroom to reprint the images on photographic paper and see how the toner reacts. In these slides, I'm comparing the images from 1 week after the toner was applied to 3 weeks after the toner was applied. Working with the current images brought me to the following questions in my artist statement. What brings value to the personal archive? How long does a personal archive hold its value? Why hold on to these moments with materials that are temporary? I've begun thinking about my personal archive and how I've maintained an archive over the years using technology. I took hundreds of pictures and videos during my middle school and high school years. Once I got a new phone, however, most of these images were lost. The only ones that were kept were ones I went out of my way to save, such as photos saved on social media accounts or a hard drive. This led me to think about what I considered important to me. What was the point of taking all those images when only a select few would be saved? Was it the convenience of taking unlimited images on a phone? Rather than having to pay for film and only having up to 36 chances to take a photo, I could take as many images as I wanted that storage would allow me, as well as edit them however I wanted without having to go to a photo store or pay for specific services. It makes me think about how I will preserve my memory. It makes me think about how I preserve my memories now. What memories from today will be saved a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? How long will my memory be preserved with the continued advancement of media? How will future generations handle my archive? I've also began to consider more broader questions. What does it mean to have access to an archive? Who has access to the resources to preserve the archive for generations to come? And what other forms does the archive exist besides in an image? My next step is to begin research on how museums and institutions preserve items and images for a long period of time. What goes into preserving a sculpture versus a painting? How much are the materials used to preserve these works? Who decides what work is valuable enough to maintain? Working with archive and memory continues to leave me with a variety of questions. I am learning to embrace the unknown and pushing to continue exploring these topics. I can't wait to see the work through, not only for myself, but with hopes of advancing the conversation of the archive and its value among various mediums and perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 15 minutes for questions.
Hi, you hear me?
Hi.
I just want to say that the presentation was amazing. I think the way that you articulated your points and made your argument was very strong, and I couldn't be prouder of you for the way that you portrayed it, especially knowing all the work that you put into it. Um, I know that we privately talked about you creating the work revolving around memorials and how you were saying that you're moving away from it, but I felt like you made some really strong points, and especially like comparing black memorials to military memorials and things like that, how there's an emphasis on one and how there isn't an emphasis on the other. So now that you've kind of articulated it the way that you did, do you think that you might revisit that, or do you think that you might revisit it in a different context, or what are your thoughts on that?
I would be open to revisiting it at a later time, but I would definitely enter the work through a different context, because as I entered the work, I don't want to say angry, but I had a chip on my shoulder, because I was very determined on making work to show the institution what they don't see every day and what I'm forced to see every day. But like, the institution don't care. So like, why am I gonna sit here and like make work for someone that doesn't care? I need to make work for myself. I need to make work that makes sense to me. So that's how I'm gonna enter the work. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
Congratulations. That was great. Can you hear me?
A little bit.
I was just gonna ask. You said that you were gonna return to the work with the memorials, but I'm wondering if you feel like you've ever like really left it. Like, are you beginning to see like your mom's archives as a type of memorial?
Can you repeat the question one more time? I couldn't hear
Sorry,
the
I'm
last
wondering.
part.
I'm wondering if you're beginning to see the archive as a memorial, because you kind of said you spoke as if you left the memorial behind, and I guess in the physical sense you did, like the one in your studio. But I think that so yeah, I'm just wondering if you're beginning to see this your current work as a memorial that was kind of handed to you.
Definitely. I definitely view the memorial as a type of archive. Um, I was thinking about, especially when I was first going into the work, of how you look in media like newspapers and like the news, and you're hearing things about these young boys and they're looked at as like menacing, like the words that they were using to describe boys. And even like in some articles they describe, like I've seen like things from back home where they describe like 16, 17-year-olds as men, And it's like, no, they're not men, they're boys. So having that, but then seeing a memorial for that person, and you see toys and you see things that reminds you that they were a child. So as far as using it as an archive, because the materials used within the memorial speak to that person's life and who they were. So, yeah.
What's up, Billy?
Hey.
Can you just talk a little bit more about the significance of owning your narrative as it pertains to archiving, especially considering the historic access or lack of access for Black and brown bodies?
Mm-hmm. Let me see. Owning your narrative in relation to the archive. That.
Like archiving is kind of like owning your own narrative. So
Mm-hmm.
like, tell me the significance for you.
For me personally, I think I'm still trying to figure out what is important to me, because the things that I held on to as a 14-year-old, taking pictures all the time, versus the things I hold on to now are drastically different. Like at 14, I just had like a bunch of selfies of like me and my friends hanging out, doing whatever. And now, if you look at my camera roll, it's not that at all. It's like filled with memes, and it's filled with like a bunch of like different things. But I think, considering about like what am I preserving for long periods of time. I guess what I want to be remembered for, and really just taking a look at myself, because I feel like because I am so young, I'm still figuring that out. What am I still trying to like? What legacy do I want to leave?
Yeah. Do you mind just talking a little bit about the significance of being an offspring of someone who did preserve images, sort of like what you're preserving images? What does this mean for your future generation of folks who might want to see those selfies and those memes that you don't think much of, like your grandmother probably didn't think much of them postcards or anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
but you saw value in it. And so what does it mean to archive something, and to like, what did it mean for your grandmother to archive something and you see value in it moving forward as it pertains to like future generations for yourself?
This is a great question. So,
Because you know how history is lost, though. You know what I mean? Like it's been pillaged.
yeah, definitely.
This is gold for me. You know what I mean?
Definitely. It's a very complex. I feel very complex thinking about it, because seeing my grandmother's images, it's like I'm finding out more, because she is a reserved woman. So seeing more about like her life and what she did and the legacy that she left, even if she doesn't think it's significant, it means the world to me personally to see. She was just like me at 24. She was just like me, trying to figure life out, trying to make sense of things, and I think where I feel it's when I try to ask her about these things, she is very reserved and she is very close with me. And my grandfather, he passed away before I really started getting into this work, so I'm not able to ask him these questions. So it's like trying to connect the dots and not having much information to go off of outside of images. I don't really have the dialogue to go with it, And it's just, I'm trying really hard not to romanticize these images also, and adding my own narrative and say like, oh, my grandmother was this, that, and the third, when she might have just been like, no, it was just this, So it's a weird space to be in, especially too about like when she passes on, what do we do with this archive now? Because I like the pictures that I see of her, like these older pictures, like, I don't know. I only know one person in that photo, So it's like passing them on to, like, let's say my kids, will they care enough to preserve it? Once, like, I'm gone and my legacy starts getting carried down, what will happen to that, So it's I feel very weird working with it, but yeah.
Hey, Billy. This was really, really great.
Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Check. So, I have a lot going on in my mind right now, and I'm trying to figure out how to sift it into a coherent question. I do want to just say, have you ever seen True Detective?
No, I haven't. I haven't.
Matthew McConaughey talks about being in this town and it feels like he's in someone's memory of the town and the memory of that town is fading. And I thought about that when I saw this. But I'm also thinking about what it means for you to age a copy of the thing instead of the actual thing. And I know that that's a decision to respect the actual property of someone else's memory. But I'm wondering how that sort of switch affects your approach to the work. And then I'm going to ask another thing.
It allows me the freedom to play around with the image because looking at the actual images, I hold them with so much, like I hold them as sacred, you know, and I don't want to. And it took me a while to even really start working with these images because I was like, I don't want to ruin it. I don't want to mess it up. I don't want to, you know, my grandmother went through, she did the best she could to try to preserve those pictures for as long as she could. And I was trying to respect her process of preserving these memories. So for me, copying them, it allows me to mess up. It allows me to alter and to get weird and just do a lot with the image to try to push something forward, like my thoughts forward, without altering what she's done, without damaging her memories, without, I guess, erasing all that she's done. Because even too, at the very beginning of this, I was taking images out and they're not in their original like format anymore, as far as the order that she had them in. And that kills me because it's like she had these in an order for a reason. I should have, you know. So I've been handling it a lot more delicately now. So it allows me to not be so delicate and just do the work and push through versus being so, I guess, hesitant to play around and figure things out.
That's so interesting because archiving is this really delicate thing. So you're like playing with that. Okay, and the third and last thing. Have you ever like read about weathering?
Say it again.
Have you ever read about weathering? In terms
A little bit, yeah.
It's like how just by being a Black woman in this country, we age faster. And of what it is to be Black in this country, it makes us age faster. And I was actually talking to Oliver about it, and he told me about like Black men have a higher rate of prostate cancer, but it's Black men in America, you know, and so it's like this accelerated aging process that we experience by being in this country. Right. And you're also engaging in an accelerated aging process within the photo. And so I think that that could be an interesting thing to like, you know, yeah,
Definitely.
to
Thank
look into
you.
a little bit more.
Yes, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right. Billy, thank you very much. I was very impressed. The clarity of all of this and the way you guided us through this different forms of memorialization, I think was very impressive. I very much go with you what it actually means, the materiality, and to discuss and negotiate those. I thought that was very, very interesting and comprehensive from my perspective. Location of memorialization, technology, etc. And in a way, it's always boils down to an externalization of feelings. Yes, I know. Okay, sorry. An externalization. Almost like permanence versus ephemerality, and what I see, you actually did pretty much the same. I feel that Gerd Richter did, where he kind of in his work tries to have personal memory meet the history, and in a way that those two aspects I feel are present in what you're doing. And of course, well, the question that I have then ultimately is, at least for me, memory is always created in the present. I mean, that's seems like it's right now that we are over and over constructing the past through looking at images, for example, or trying to memorize or exchange of discussion. How do you relate that to your own work, knowing, I assume, that the past is always constructed over and over again in the present right now in which we are living? What is that? What are the consequences of that for you?
Okay, you were going in and out. So, so you're saying, can you say it one more time? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear fully. Yeah.
Well, I think it's. I mean, yeah. Okay, cool. All right. It's the past is constructed in the present, and images often help a lot doing that. What are the consequences? What does that do? Knowing that the sort of what we call authenticity, or that we are rereading and reinventing the past, pretty much. What we
I,
call memory is really just ultimately a new construction every time.
I've been questioning this a lot as well. I was writing about this, I think maybe last month, um, about if we can just reconstruct memory, if we can just reconstruct how we remember things, what's truth. Um, if you're wrong about something and then you can just remember it as like, oh, well, I wasn't wrong, or you can just justify it, then where does accountability take place? So I'm questioning that as well. I want to incorporate that even more into my work because is there a right or wrong if we all just make our own standards for things? So, what is the standard? Is there a standard? So, I'm still thinking about that as well. Yeah.
I guess to follow up that, I was thinking about during your presentation, how do you separate the narrative of your research with your own interpretation of that, and whether those two things are separate or whether they are just two different sides of the same coin?
Whew, that is a good question. Another thing I think I'm still trying to work through because I'm not 100% sure. Um, because I have thought about whether or not to add my own personal narrative. Like, yes, these are my grandmother's images, but then like, what can I say using like knowing the time frame of these and having the liberty of pretty much, especially with her not revealing much to me about the images. What freedom do I have with that? And then I've been thinking about too, is that my place to do that, to place a narrative on like another narrative on something that wasn't intended to have that narrative? So I'm still thinking about that and still thinking that through. I think, did I answer your question at all? No? Yeah. I did.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take 15 minutes break.